basic steps to the storytelling art. I'm taking this with permission from the Scriptures in Use teaching manual, to which I've referred to in other video recordings. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take you through and add a few tips and tricks and ideas to how to use these 7 steps to learn to tell a Bible story orally. All right, and there's an example in here. I did actually copy paste this material directly onto Blackboard, but I think a video that explains this might be useful. So, as you've already noted, we're following the example of Jesus as the storyteller. And so, if we're trying to learn how stories are passed down and told to each other in an oral culture, then to take advantage of what these people have learned over the last 30 years of working it in the field would be, I believe, useful to us to learn how to become storytellers. So these are the practical steps that you can take to learn and tell scripture stories. And in our case, that's parables. So here we go. And I've already put the lesson 4 video up there, called, let's see, Stories for the Journey. And so theoretically, you've already looked at that. I'm not going to go through this. This is the text to that video. But here it is. Here are the 7 steps. And what I've done for this course is use the first 3 weeks to go through these 7 basic steps to the storytelling art and break them up, so that we're going to cover the first 2 steps, which you've already done in week 1. Choose an appropriate story. In fact, in your case, you're going to choose 3 appropriate stories, parables, from the list of dozens of parables that Jesus told during his ministry on earth. And you're going to do a breakdown. If you've written scripts before, you know that we're talking really essentially about a beat sheet, but there's an example down here in just a second. You're going to learn the structure of the story and divide it into its parts. That theoretically is what happened to you last week. Again, and this is done without writing it down. I want to emphasize that oral storytellers do this without writing it down at first. Eventually they get to notes for themselves. This week, week 2, you're going to do 3 things. Imagine the setting of the story in your mind. In other words, you're going to get to yourself and you're going to think through the story. Imagine it happening in your mind. This is called mind cinema, or cinema of the mind. And you get to choose. This is where your cultural choosings can come into place. In other words, where do you imagine this story taking place? The setting of the story in your mind. The cool thing about the parables is Jesus told them in the cultural setting that was appropriate for his time and his geographic location. But the parables, since they're not about historical characters and persons, you can put them anywhere at any time. What you have to do is just remember that there are some things that have to remain. So if you're going to tell the story of Jesus meeting Zacchaeus on the road, Zacchaeus has climbed up a tree to be able to see better because he's short. The setting of the story could change. He still has to climb something. He could climb a ladder, a telephone pole, doesn't have to be a tree, but the setting is something you need to take some time. For all 3 of your parables, take the time to imagine where these stories might be best or most interestingly told. All right, so that's going to be the first thing you're going to do this week. Week 2 is take each one of your 3 parables and imagine, think through, play through several scenarios. Where could each one of these 3 stories take place? Number 4, now you're going to imagine the action taking place in the story. The parables don't have a lot of action to some of them. All right, so you take the parable of the prodigal son, and he goes up into a far country. Well, that's one line of action. He goes into a far country. You can imagine a lot more, probably. All right, how does he get to the far country? Does he take a train, a plane, a bus, his car, his old rickety pickup truck, or a camel? It's up to you. You can imagine the action taking place in this story. And if we were writing a screenplay, then we would say that this is, you're deciding on the plot. You're deciding. Now, The the story is, you can't, again, to maintain the fidelity of the story, you can't change it radically. In other words, you can't change the action of the story that's different. You can add to it, you can fill it out, you can give it more detail, but you can't radically change it. So, that's just, imagine the action taking place in the story. You're going to see an example here in just a second. All right, and then the fifth thing, use your voice to project the images you've imagined. All right, skilled storytellers have sometimes different accents, different dialects. I've done a lot of voiceover work, and sometimes they really want my Professor Andrew Quick, the one who says, "Mark, where is my remote? I don't know." And you just can learn some different ways to do this. There's also the Texan. I've come from San Antonio, Texas, and I've learned how to speak as many Texans do, sort of low down and drawing out the vowels a little bit more. There's different ways to do this. So use your voice to project the images you've imagined. There's some confidence involved. There's some character voicings involved. I'm not saying you have to turn it into a performance. What we're doing is we're drafting orally, we're drafting your story at this point. And this will help you do the other stages of the process later on. But take the time to be creative here. We don't really know what Zacchaeus sounded like, so make it up. You could make him, so you want to come to my house today? I don't know. I don't think I have anything in the refrigerator. I think I have some luncheon meat or something like that. But okay, you can come to my house if you want to. That's just me. I just did that right off the top of my head. Zacchaeus sounds to me, that's the way I imagine his voice. To you, it could be something else. In fact, you could even change gender. You could make Zacchaeus a female. You can't make Jesus a female, but you can make Zacchaeus a female. All right, but these are not parables. We're using Zacchaeus, the story of Zacchaeus and Jesus, as an example. All right, then on week 3, what you're going to do is you're going to learn the story by memory. Now, that's different than memorize. You're not going to memorize it. No. You're going to learn the story by memory. One of the reasons that I posted some videos of a couple of professional Story Festival winners in the videos this week is so that you can see that they don't have anything memorized. They have, and I'm going to continue to do this. I'm going to continue to put out there the example videos of people who are telling stories from their memory. It's playing out in their mind. And I've got some new videos for this week from a woman named Dr. Hannah Harvey, Hannah B. Harvey. She is, believe it or not, she's got a PhD in storytelling. If you can believe that, it's amazing. So I'm going to post some of her videos, her instructional videos, and she's going to talk about this. She's going to talk about learning the story by memory. We'll get to that in a few more minutes. And then the seventh thing, and this is the most important, the most historically accurate aspect of this whole thing right here, practice the story until it comes naturally. This is something that has been happening for thousands of years. People simply practice it and try it again, record it again, look at it yourself, get some people together, practice telling it to some people, get some honest feedback, practice. There's that old joke that you ask a budding violinist, so how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer is always practice. Well, that's true for storytelling as well. 7 steps for dialogue. 7 steps for dialogue is you imagine how the story's going to go. The parables give you some dialogue. You can add to the dialogue without radically changing the story. And so the The story of the Good Samaritan, for example. You only have, for example, the line to the innkeeper, he says to the innkeeper, "We'll take care of him until I come back. Here's some money. I'll pay the rest of it when I come back." That's it. Yeah, that's one line of dialogue you get from the Good Samaritan to the innkeeper. But I've done this parable as a performance before, and it's a lot of fun to add all kinds of different, in some cases, comedy dialogue to this. I'm not opposed to you adding some levity. We don't have to make the parables, many of them look really funny to me. The parable of the prodigal son is not very funny, but there are definitely some possible funny things that you could get to. You could work into your story in the dialogue. Why not? Why not? Most people will receive something that's comedic more easily than they will something that's overly dramatic. All right, number 2, use the natural cultural patterns to introduce the story. So again, you're going to have to choose what cultural situation do you want this to be in. I have some very good friends who live in South Georgia. His name is Michael, and her name is Erin, and they have 3 beautiful children. And they live, as they say, below the gnat line in Georgia. And so there are definitely some natural cultural patterns to introduce to the story. If you took the stories, the parables, and you took them down to way south of Atlanta, down to maybe Savannah, maybe even further south, all the way to the coastline, and there would be ways of talking, food that you eat, etiquette that you, for example, in the deep south, you don't call somebody just Caroline. If you want to show that person some respect, you say, "Miss Caroline. Miss Caroline, can I drop this off for you later on? I would dearly love to get your opinion on this story that I'm writing. Thank you very much. I'll bring flowers if you'll have some tea ready for us." You see what I'm saying? There are natural cultural patterns that exist in every culture in the world. And that includes the way they talk, the way they move, the way they act, the way they dress. And all these things, you get to make it up. You get to visualize and play this in your mind and work it out for yourself. This is the real fun of storytelling as far as I'm concerned. I love this part. And then for feedback, encourage listeners to retell the story accurately. This is to see if anybody has actually listened to your story and done it correctly. Ask questions that help the listeners review the story. Ask questions to help you discover what the listener has understood, and be sensitive in dealing with incorrect answers, and use the discussion time to develop positive relationships. So this is what you do when you get ready to get feedback from people. All right, choose carefully an appropriate story. And we already talked about learn the structure of the story. Here's an example. Let's see here. I keep skipping over this. Let's see. Learn the structure of the story and divide it into easy memorized parts. Let's see here. This will help those of us who come from book cultures, which of course is you and me, because most stories have a beginning, middle, and an end. There's Aristotle for you. And we may look over each story and divide it into smaller, more manageable parts. This is what television writers do. They divide the story into beats because they have to. They're limited to a certain number of beats per 22-minute or 48-minute episode. And so you're saying, well, we can only put in, whatever it is, 17 beats. And so you plan them very carefully. Let's see here. So you're going to look over each story and divide it into smaller, more manageable parts. And this is for memory. This is so that you can memorize each event of a story, and instead of memorizing the lines, so to speak, like a play. So here's the story of Zacchaeus. Could be divided into 6 natural parts. In the beginning, we find ourselves in Jericho. The tax collector Zacchaeus is standing in the crowd, finds out that Jesus is passing through. and but he's too short to see Jesus. Next, Zacchaeus runs ahead and climbs into the sycamore tree, and he waits for Jesus to come by. Then Jesus passes by and sees Zacchaeus approaching the tree. Jesus tells Zacchaeus to come down and take him to his house. Now we notice that people saw Jesus going to the house of Zacchaeus and were not happy with him. Then inside the house, Zacchaeus tells Jesus that he will give half of his money to the poor. And lastly, Jesus said to him, "Today's salvation has come to the house." And that's the whole point of the parable. There it is. You want to get to the punchline of this short story, and that is, today, Zacchaeus, salvation has come to this house. That's the point, and you want to have every part of the story get to that punchline. So, to extend the example here, we've divided this story into 6 easy to remember main events. And so, let's see. And if we listed them out, you could see what those 6 parts are right there. And all you have to do, so as you're learning this story, you just have to think to yourself, okay, the next part is Jesus tells Zacchaeus to come down and take him to his house. There we go. That's a part. And so you just have to remember that. Not memorize that line, but remember that's what comes next. All right. To get to what you're dealing with in week 2, imagine the setting of the story in your mind. Step 3 tells us to imagine the setting of the story in our mind. It is important that as storytellers we identify with the story. The location, the characters, the biblical times should become familiar to us, or whatever culture you put it in. It doesn't have to be biblical times. We should try to imagine short little Zacchaeus. What does he look like? How does he dress? How does he speak? You know, a tax collector in a crowded Jericho on a market day. We imagine the sycamore tree and palm tree oasis in the desert, which is what Jericho was. Jericho was built around a spring, an oasis in the desert. The whole town is built around that. And so we will not put all these descriptions into our stories because it would change the biblical words and accuracy, and it would be too much. As you figure out how to draft your story in your mind and you practice it, you're going to say to yourself, I'm spending too much time describing this silly tree. I can trim it back to 25 words instead of 100. And because what happens is, here's a little tip and trick. If you give just enough of a description of things, the people, the place, the conversations, and so forth, the imagination, this is C.S. Lewis bringing in here, the imagination will fill in the blanks. So you can say sycamore tree, but if you fill it in a little bit more, if you can say that it has white bark, and it has shiny, dark green leaves, and it has a yellow flower in the spring, that's enough. You've now painted that picture in the mind of your hearers, and they're going to fill in the rest with what they want. All right, so the description, make the setting of the story in your mind, but as you practice it, give them just enough words for the setting. All right, and let's see. And of course, what this will do is, if you can see it in your mind, if you can see it playing, if you can see the story playing out in your mind, it will help you to experience the story yourself and memorize and learn the story and make it your own. This is why I say choose the culture carefully. All right, next step. This is actually step 4. Imagine the action taking place in the story. We imagine the action takes place in the story. We picture in our mind the excitement of seeing Jesus through the crowds. We imagine the pushing and shoving of the masses of people. We try to imagine how it would look if we were standing right there. And that's what you want. You want to place yourself in the story so that you can describe it to your hearers, so that they can be there with you. All right? This is that orality quality that people want in a story. They want to be immersed in the story that you're telling. They want to feel like they're there. The look of joy on Zacchaeus' face when Jesus asked to come to his house, and the contempt on the faces of those who saw Jesus enter Zacchaeus' house, the actions of Zacchaeus taking out his money and the look on Jesus' face. The key to telling this story well is to see the story in your imagination as a real event, and in fact we know it was. We know that there actually literally was a human being, fully God, fully man, Jesus, who literally walked on the streets of Jericho. Well, he walked on the streets of, he walked all through that whole area out there. And we know that the historical thing happened, that he met a man named Zacchaeus and went to his house, and salvation came to his house because Jesus went there. That's historical fact. But now your imagination needs to see it clearly so that you can tell that story the way you want to. Here's another way of thinking about this. If you can turn the sound off, if you are thinking of this in terms of a movie, and you were to turn this into a movie, and there was narration over the top of the movie, and all of this is taking place, you should build the action in such a way that's taking place in the story that people don't need the narration to know what's going on. That's how well you have imagined the action taking place in this story. It has to look that real in your own mind for you to be able to tell this story well. All right? Okay, moving on. Use your voice to project the images you imagined. Let's see here. You should try to project your voice in a way that is appropriate to the mood of the story. If those of you guys who have ever worked on stage without a microphone, I've done plenty of that. I used to do Shakespeare in the Park, man, and there were no microphones. Shakespeare in the Park, we would come into, I was with a troupe of people, excuse me as I cough. We would come into a park and set up our stage and put on our costumes, and there were no microphones. And so people would come in close, and you had to project in such a way that even a whisper could be heard to the back of that crowd, however big they were. In some cases, it was thousands of people. And so you have to use a voice in a way that is appropriate to the mood of the story. So if it's a quiet, desperate, respectful, dramatic story, like for example, the story of Jairus' daughter dying, and Jesus comes into that house, and there's all kinds of mourners going on, and there's like whispering, and there's tears, and you're not going to come into a story like that. You're not going to tell that story with shouts, people. You're going to tell that story with a voice that's appropriate to the mood of the story. You people who are actors, you're going to get this. You're going to understand that you have to adapt that tone, that instrument that is your body, the voice, to bring it down low if you need to. Bring it down low. Or bring it up high, very high if you need to, if it's appropriate. And I added a British accent there as well. It's very like the Queen. Hello, I'm the Queen of England. Bow down, genuflect, yes, curtsy if you will. So you have to choose a voice and project a voice that's appropriate to the mood of the story. If it's comedy, use a voice that does that. One of the reasons I added that entire concert, that comedy concert by Michael Jr. in this week's videos that are available, is so that you can get that. There is a voice, a dialect, a cultural lexicon of words even, that is appropriate to the mood of the stories that Michael Jr. is telling. And it's comedic. He's trying to be funny. Every stand-up comedian does that. All right, so you pay attention to the volume of our voice, from the whisper to the shout of John the Baptist. Expressions of grief, anger, concern are clear, and will make the stories come alive to the listener. A pause will add drama and suspense. Let me just camp on that for just a moment. You don't have to fill every moment with something. As you begin to learn to tell stories, you're going to notice, for example, that you tend to fill silences with things that are just not necessary. We're talking about the ums, or the stutterings, or whatever. Sometimes you're going to fill it with words that are just outside of the story. And when you start to do that, you start to make it difficult for your audience to stay with your story. They quit suspending their disbelief, and they're not immersed anymore. So it takes practice. All right, I'm moving down to what we're going to do next week. Next week, in week 3, learn the story by memory. And you can read this as well as I can. We've talked about that a little bit already. You learn it, not memorize it. And practicing the story until it comes naturally. All right, so there it is. We've gone over the 7-step process with the example of Zacchaeus meeting Jesus on a road in Jericho. And you need to begin the process of practicing this process, this 7-step process. This week you're going to concentrate on steps 3, 4, and 5, and next week steps 6 and 7, so that this should just come naturally. This should just come easy, and it's something that you can do in your sleep. Because here's the payoff. Here's the payoff. If you can retrain your brain to think like this when you're developing stories, when you get a story idea in years to come and you go, that would make a great movie. I have thoughts like that every day. And sources come from all over the place. I get probably 10 good film, television series, story ideas a day. And they can come from anywhere. And once you begin to say, let me develop that a little bit, this process right here will help you figure out whether it will work as a story or not, whether it's marketable or not. And let me just say one more thing. Telling stories from the Bible and picking the ones that are important to you are going to be a way to tell stories that are of you. There's an old adage in film and television that if producers and directors decided that they wanted to tell your life story, they would hire somebody else to write it and other actors other than you to portray you. Why? It's because telling your own story, what the so-called personal narratives, it loses objectivity. It's not really usually very possible for you to tell a story as powerfully. If it's yours, you're just too close to it. It's the craft of creating and crafting a story into something that a lot of people will be touched by and be impacted by, especially redemptively. It has to be done from the outside looking in. So as you're working on these parables, of course you're going to see that your life comes into your life experience, your knowledge, your pain, your laughter, your relationships. It will impact, and it should impact the stories that you're telling. But what I'm saying is, don't make these autobiographical. Tell these stories the way the Holy Spirit is directing you to tell these stories. Get yourself out of the way and let the Holy Spirit show you the most powerful story you can tell.